In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by greed, a new legend is about to be told. Fate has a cruel way of giving us exactly what we need at the moment we least expect it. Before the harvest begins, offer your tribute. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing so you won't miss the secrets buried deep in the soil. Now prepare yourselves. The air in the First National Bank of Garrison County was cold. Not the pleasant, conditioned cool of a summer afternoon, but a sterile, indifferent cold that seemed to emanate from the polished marble floors and seep into the bones. It was the kind of cold that made a man feel like a specimen under glass, catalogued and judged by invisible forces. John Miller felt it in his knuckles, which were stiff from a morning spent wrestling with a rusted-out fence post on the northmost edge of his property. A stubborn piece of steel that refused to yield to anything less than pure, obstinate will. He stood near the velvet rope line, a patient, weathered statue amidst the hurried, anxious choreography of modern finance. His clothes, a pair of faded denim overalls over a flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows, were clean but permanently stained with the earth he worked. His boots carried a faint, honest dusting of the prairie, a silent testament to a world that existed far beyond these sterile walls. He needed $50, just enough for a new set of hinges and a box of galvanized screws from the hardware store down the street. It wasn't a transaction that would make the bank's quarterly reports, but it was a transaction that held the line against the slow, persistent entropy that was always trying to reclaim a working farm. It mattered. He had been waiting for 20 minutes, a ghost invisible to the suited men and women who bustled around him, their movements sharp and their voices clipped, their entire existence seemingly a performance for an unseen audience. A young man with hair so perfectly sculpted it looked like a helmet of black ice strode through the lobby. His suit was a sharp, aggressive shade of charcoal. His shoes gleamed with a painful brilliance under the recessed lighting, and a gold watch peeked from his cuff like a captured piece of the sun. This was Blake Harrison, the branch manager. He moved with the predatory grace of someone who believed the world was a ladder, and he was already several rungs above everyone else, kicking down at the fingers of those below. Blake's eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept across the lobby, cataloging, assessing, and dismissing. They snagged on John for a fraction of a second, and in that moment a flicker of profound irritation crossed his features. It was the look of a man finding a weed in his perfectly manicured garden, an imperfection that personally offended his sense of order. Blake turned his attention to a woman in a Chanel suit, her hair a lacquered helmet of blonde, his voice instantly transforming into a smooth, cultured purr. "Mrs. Davenport, a pleasure. Let me handle that transfer for you personally." He guided her to his glass-walled office, leaving John standing by the rope, the scent of expensive perfume and entitlement lingering in the air like a toxic fog. The clock on the wall ticked, each second a small, metallic tap of dismissal against the silence of John's patience. A man who watches seasons turn for a living learns the futility of impatience. But as the minutes stretched on, and Blake schmoozed with two other clients John recognized from the country club set, men who measured their worth in stock options and golf handicaps, a slow, cold burn began to build in his chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the familiar, weary ache of being misjudged, of being weighed and found wanting by a scale that couldn't measure the things that truly mattered. The integrity of a man's word, the sweat on his brow, the legacy left in the soil for his children. Finally, after another 10 minutes of being pointedly ignored, a calculated act of social sorting, John took a quiet step forward, approaching a teller who was studiously avoiding his gaze. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a creek. Before the teller could respond, Blake reappeared, his smile from the previous client vanishing the instant he saw John. The professional mask dropped, revealing a raw, undisguised contempt. "Can I help you?" The question was not an offer, it was a challenge, a territorial warning from an animal defending its gilded cage. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," John said calmly, his gaze steady. He had faced down charging bulls and stared into the heart of thunderstorms that could tear a barn from its foundation. This preening boy held no terror for him. Blake's lips curled into a sneer. He let his eyes travel from John's dusty boots up to his weathered face, a slow, deliberate act of theatrical disdain designed for the audience of the entire lobby. The other customers, sensing a drama, fell quiet. The tellers froze. The only sound was the hum of the computers. "A withdrawal," Blake echoed, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured vaguely at John's appearance. "From what exactly?" "A mattress fund. I think you have the wrong establishment. This is a place of business, not a homeless shelter." The words hung in the chilled air, sharp and cruel. A few people snickered. Mrs. Davenport covered her mouth with a gloved hand, her eyes wide with a kind of cruel amusement. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread across John's neck. He felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him, pinning him like an insect to a board. For a lifetime, he had lived by a simple code passed down from his father. Work hard, be honest, treat others with the respect you expect for yourself. He had built an empire on that code, an empire of soil and sky that this boy in his shiny shoes couldn't possibly comprehend. And in this moment, in this temple of polished surfaces and hollow men, that code was being ground under the heel of a cheap suit. He kept his composure, the years of quiet dignity serving as a dam against the rising tide of indignation. He had weathered droughts, blizzards, and falling markets. He could weather this. John's gaze didn't waver. It remained fixed on the young manager, a calm sea before a storm. "I have an account here," he stated, his voice even, though the effort to keep it so was immense. He could feel the pulse in his temples, a slow, heavy drumbeat. Blake let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a sound that cracked the sterile silence of the bank, a whip of pure derision. "An account? Here, sir, we have standards. We have minimum balance requirements that likely exceed the value of everything you are currently wearing, including that vehicle I saw you pull up in." He gestured toward the window, where John's 1978 Ford F-150 sat parked by the curb. The truck, lovingly maintained but undeniably old, was a faded sky blue, its body a testament to decades of hard work, with dents and scratches that were like paragraphs in a long and storied life. To Blake, it was just junk. "Now I have been patient," Blake continued, his voice rising, taking on the tone of a man asserting his dominance. He was performing now, playing to the crowd of wealthy patrons who were watching with detached interest. "I have important clients to attend to, people who understand the value of time and, frankly, contribute to the success of this institution. You are wasting my time and theirs." He took a step closer, invading John's personal space, his cologne a cloying chemical fog. "I am going to ask you one last time to leave, quietly." "I'd like to speak with the branch manager," John said, his voice dropping lower, gaining a granite-like solidity. The response was another bark of laughter, this one louder and more mocking. Blake spread his hands wide, a gesture of absolute theatrical power. "You're looking at him. I am the manager, Blake Harrison, MBA, Stanford class of '08. And I am telling you, in my capacity as the final authority in this building, to get out." He pointed a manicured finger toward the door. "Now, before I'm forced to have you removed." The dam inside John finally broke. not with a roar of anger, but with a sudden, profound clarity. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the universe preparing us for who we're meant to become. He saw the situation for what it was, a test, a crucible. He had spent his life building something real, something tangible, something that would outlast him and the generations to come. He had done it quietly, without fanfare, valuing the substance of his work over the performance of wealth. But this boy, this embodiment of a system that judged the book by its cover, the harvest by the shine on the tractor, had forced his hand. The universe had presented him with a moment, and he had to choose who he was going to be. A quiet old farmer who would shuffle away in shame, or the man who owned the very ground this bank was built upon. "You don't want to do that, son," John said, his voice no longer just calm, but carrying a weight that seemed to make the air thicker. Blake's face, which had been a mask of arrogant triumph, hardened into a scowl of genuine anger. The challenge to his authority coming from such a source was an intolerable insult. "Is that a threat? Are you threatening me?" He snapped his fingers, and a portly security guard near the door, who had been watching with a conflicted expression, straightened up. "Security, escort this vagrant out of my bank. And if he gives you any trouble, call the police." Blake's voice rang with finality. He turned his back on John, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He then added over his shoulder, a final, venomous barb intended for the entire lobby to hear. "If you actually have an account here, I'll eat my tie. People like you don't bank with us. You don't even belong in the same town." The guard began to walk slowly, reluctantly toward John. The other customers murmured, some with pity, most with smug satisfaction. The world was being put back in its proper order. The rich in their offices, the poor on the street. John Miller watched the guard approach. He watched Blake preen. He felt the weight of 100 years of his family's sweat and toil on his shoulders. He reached not for his wallet, but into the deep inner pocket of his overalls. His gnarled, calloused fingers, which could calibrate a combine to within a millimeter and tell the moisture content of soil by touch alone, emerged with a small, worn object. It was a checkbook. The cover was soft, creased leather, stained with oil and dirt. It looked as old and unassuming as he did. He flipped it open on the marble countertop next to the teller's station, the soft slap of the leather echoing in the now silent room. The guard stopped in his tracks. Blake, hearing the sound and sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, turned back around, an impatient scowl on his face. John picked up the chained pen from the counter. His movements were slow, deliberate, each one imbued with a sense of ceremony. He uncapped it. The scratch of the nib on the paper was the only sound. He didn't write for $50. He wrote a number with a 1 and 7 zeros after it. $10 million. He filled in the date. In the memo line with the same steady hand, he wrote 2 words, account closure. He signed his name at the bottom, John C. Miller. The signature was a strong, confident script, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who had signed deeds and contracts that shaped the destiny of the entire county for 50 years. He slid the check across the polished marble. It glided silently, a small paper missile aimed at the very heart of Blake Harrison's world. It stopped directly in front of the young manager. "Cash this," John said, his voice flat, devoid of anger, holding only the cold, hard finality of a business transaction. "I'm closing my account." Blake stared at the check as if it were a coiled snake. His first instinct was to laugh again, to call it a pathetic, delusional bluff. But something in John's eyes, a hardness he hadn't seen before, held him in place. He looked down at the check. The paper was worn, the account information printed in an old-fashioned font. The name John C. Miller meant nothing to him, but the number $10 million, it was absurd, impossible. His mind, trained to see the world in neat columns of assets and liabilities, couldn't process the data. The man in rags, the ancient truck, the number with 7 zeros. It was a glitch in his reality. "This is a joke," Blake stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre. He was trying to project authority, but a tremor of uncertainty had crept in. "A very, very bad joke. Writing a fraudulent check is a federal offense. I could have you arrested for this." "It's not a joke," John replied, his voice still level. "And the check is good. Run the account number." Blake hesitated. A part of him, the part that lived in fear of his superiors and the unyielding logic of the banking system, knew he had to follow procedure. The other part, the arrogant, image-obsessed part, was screaming that this was a waste of time, a further humiliation. But the eyes of the lobby were on him. His performance of power had reached its climax, and now he had to deliver. To expose the fraud would be to reassert his dominance. With a theatrical sigh of exasperation, he snatched the check from the counter. "Fine, let's put an end to this circus." He strode to the nearest open teller window, pushing the young woman, Sarah, aside with a muttered, "I'll handle this." He sat down in her chair, his movements jerky and irritated. He smoothed the check on the desk, his fingers tracing the impossible number. He typed the account number into the system, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed. He was already composing the speech he would give the police. He hit enter, and his world broke. The screen did not flash with the familiar, expected message, "Insufficient funds." Instead, the entire monitor was flooded with a blinding, screaming crimson. In the center, in huge block letters, a message appeared that Blake had only ever read about in training manuals, a message reserved for the highest echelons of the financial world. "VIP alert. Board-level clearance required. Do not proceed. Contact Regional Director immediately. Protocol Omega." Blake stared at the screen. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, pale mask. His mouth went dry. Protocol Omega. That was the designation for the bank's founders, for state senators, for the kind of clients whose names were whispered in hushed, reverent tones in board meetings. It was for people who didn't just have money, they were money. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He clicked the mouse, trying to access the account details, but every attempt was met with the same impenetrable red wall. Access DENIED. He looked at the available balance field. It was blank, not zero, just blank, as if the very concept of a limit did not apply. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. His carefully constructed reality was crumbling into digital dust. He looked up from the monitor, his eyes wide with a dawning horror, and met the calm, steady gaze of the old farmer. The man hadn't moved. He just stood there, watching, waiting. And for the first time, Blake didn't see a vagrant. He saw an executioner. The panic was a physical assault. It clawed its way up Blake's throat, hot and acidic. He could feel his starched collar suddenly choking him, the silk of his expensive tie tightening like a noose. A system glitch. A hack, a case of mistaken identity. But the name on the check, John C. Miller, matched the name on the VIP alert. It wasn't a mistake. He, Blake Harrison, had just publicly humiliated a man who required board-level clearance. He felt a wave of nausea so intense he had to grip the edge of the desk. The whispers in the lobby had changed. The amusement was gone, replaced by a tense, confused curiosity. They could all see his face. They could see the terror. His phone, sitting on the desk, began to buzz violently. The screen lit up with a name that made his blood run cold. Franklin Davies, Regional Director. Blake's hand trembled as he reached for it. Before he could even answer, the heavy glass doors of the bank burst open with such force that they banged against the stoppers. A man in his late 50s, with a mane of silver hair and a face etched with a level of anxiety Blake had never seen on him, stormed into the lobby. It was Franklin Davies himself. He wasn't supposed to be here. He worked out of the corporate headquarters 60 miles away. His eyes, frantic and searching, scanned the room, flying past the well-dressed clients, past the frozen tellers, past Blake's own terrified face. And then they locked onto John Miller. The transformation was instantaneous and shocking. The panic on Franklin Davies' face melted away, replaced by an expression of profound, overwhelming relief. He ignored everyone, including his own branch manager. He walked directly toward John, his stride quick and purposeful. He didn't offer a handshake. He threw his arms around the old farmer in a firm, respectful embrace. "John, Mr. Miller, my God, I am so sorry. I got the alert and drove here as fast as I could. I broke every speed limit on the highway," Davies said, his voice loud enough for the entire bank to hear. He pulled back, his hands still gripping John's shoulders, his expression a mixture of deference and genuine affection. "Why didn't you just call me? You have my personal cell. You shouldn't have to be waiting in line like this." John simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Franklin, it's been a while." Blake watched the scene, paralyzed. Franklin Davies, his boss, the man he spent his entire career trying to impress, was hugging the vagrant. The pieces of the puzzle were reassembling themselves in his mind, but they were forming a picture of his own professional demise. Davies finally seemed to notice him, and the warmth vanished from the regional director's face, replaced by a glacial fury. He released John's shoulders and took a slow, deliberate step toward Blake. "Mr. Harrison," Davies began, the title sounding like an accusation. "Can you please explain to me what in the hell is going on here? I receive a Protocol Omega alert, the first one in my 5 years as director, linked to a $10 million account closure request from your branch. I find one of our most valued legacy clients standing in the middle of the lobby, looking displeased." "Talk now." Blake opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, to say, "Look at him. How was I supposed to know?" But he knew, with a sickening certainty, that any excuse he could offer would only dig his grave deeper. John saved him the trouble. "Your manager was just escorting me out," he said, the words simple, factual, and utterly devastating. "He felt I didn't meet the bank's standards." Davies' eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of pure rage. He turned his full attention to Blake, his face a mask of disbelief and contempt. The other clients were now openly staring, their phones discreetly pointed toward the unfolding drama. This was a spectacle far more interesting than interest rates. This was the public execution of a career. "You did what?" Davies whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the force of a physical blow. He looked around the lobby, at the marble floors, the high ceilings. Then he looked back at Blake, a cruel, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Let me tell you something about standards, Mr. Harrison. Let me educate you." He gestured with a sweeping arm, encompassing the entire building. "You see this branch? This beautiful, profitable branch in the heart of the most fertile county in the state. You see the land it's sitting on." He paused, then pointed a single, trembling finger at John Miller. "You just tried to evict the man who owns it. All of it." The reveal landed with the force of a thunderclap. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Blake's knees felt weak. The owner, the man on the land the bank was built on. Impossible. He had reviewed the branch's lease agreements. The landlord was a holding corporation, Emagri Vest Properties LLC, an anonymous, faceless entity. Davies saw the confusion on Blake's face and decided to twist the knife. "Mr. Miller doesn't just have an account here, you Ivy League fool. He's our landlord. Emagri Vest Properties. That's his company. He owns 50,000 acres of prime agricultural land in this county, including this very parcel. The Miller family leased this plot to the bank's founder, his grandfather to my grandfather's business partner, 90 years ago on a handshake. We are tenants in his world. We pay him rent. He doesn't have a minimum balance. His balance is the ground beneath our goddamn feet. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Blake's career. The foundation of his world wasn't just cracking. It had been revealed to be an illusion. He had spat in the face of the king while standing in the king's castle, all because the king wasn't wearing his crown. He looked at John Miller again. The faded overalls, the worn boots. It wasn't the costume of a poor man. It was the uniform of a man who had nothing to prove. A man whose wealth was so vast, so fundamental that he didn't need to display it. It was in the soil, in the sun, in the rain. The other customers who had smirked at John's expense now looked at him with a mixture of awe and terror. They were staring at a ghost from an older, more powerful America. Blake finally found his voice, a pathetic, reedy whisper. "Mr. Miller, I had no idea. I am so sorry." John held up a hand and Blake fell silent immediately. The old farmer's eyes were not filled with triumph or anger. They were filled with a deep, weary disappointment. He looked past Blake to Franklin Davies. "Franklin, I came in here today for $50 to buy some hinges for a gate. My father banked here. My grandfather banked here. We helped build this town. We believed in this bank." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the opulent lobby. "But this isn't my grandfather's bank anymore. It's become a place that values a shiny suit more than a lifetime of loyalty." He reached out and gently took the $10 million check from Blake's numb fingers. A flicker of desperate hope ignited in Blake's chest. John looked down at the check. "I've decided I'm not going to close my account." The relief that washed over Blake was so powerful it almost buckled his knees. "Mr. Miller, thank you, I assure you." John cut him off, his voice as sharp and cold as a winter wind. "Don't misunderstand me. I'm not keeping my money here because I forgive you. I'm keeping it here because this is my town, and this is my bank, and I'm not going to be run out of it by a boy who mistakes arrogance for authority." He then turned his cool, steady gaze directly on Blake. The weary disappointment was gone, replaced by a quiet, implacable judgment. "I don't want to withdraw my money. I want to withdraw your employment." The words were a death sentence. Franklin Davies, who had been watching the exchange with a grim expression, nodded slowly. This was not about banking policy anymore. This was about justice. "Blake Harrison," Davies said, his voice now formal, stripped of all emotion. "Effective immediately, your employment with First National Bank is terminated. Please clear out your personal belongings from your office. Security will escort you." The same guard who had been ordered to remove John now stepped forward, his expression a careful blank. But this time he walked toward Blake. The symmetry was brutal, poetic. "But sir, my career. Your record now includes attempting to eject the single most important client and strategic partner this institution has in the entire Midwest." Davies cut in, his voice merciless. "Consider yourself lucky I don't file a formal report that will ensure you never work in finance again. Now, get your things." Defeated, Blake turned and began the long, humiliating walk toward his glass-walled office. Every eye followed him. As he reached his office door, John's voice stopped him one last time. "Mr. Harrison." Blake turned, his face pale and drawn. John reached into the pocket of his overalls and his hand emerged holding not a checkbook, but a single, crisp dollar bill. He walked toward Blake, his worn boots making no sound on the marble floor. He held out the bill. "What's this for?" Blake asked, his voice cracking. "For the bus," John said, his expression completely serious. "Since you don't have a company car anymore." He pressed the dollar into Blake's limp hand. The gesture was the final, devastating act of catharsis. It wasn't just about firing him. It was about stripping him of the very status he held so dear. A single tear traced a path down Blake's cheek. He snatched the dollar, turned without another word, and disappeared into his office. John turned back to Franklin Davies. "Franklin, I want you to promote Sarah from the teller line to interim manager," he said, pointing to the young woman Blake had shoved aside. "She's always been polite. She knows the customers by name. She understands what this bank is supposed to be about." Davies didn't hesitate. "Consider it done, John. Anything else?" John shook his head. "That's all. I've got to get to the hardware store before it closes. Gate's not going to fix itself." He turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd of customers parted for him like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of fear and respect. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the warm, late afternoon sun. The conditioned air of the bank washed off him, replaced by the familiar scent of dry grass and distant rain. He walked over to his old Ford truck. He ran his hand along a dent in the fender, a memory of a harsh winter 20 years ago when he'd slid on a patch of ice while hauling feed to a Snowden herd. Every mark on the truck was a story. He climbed into the cab. The air smelled of oil, coffee, and earth. It was the smell of his life. He put the key in the ignition, and the old engine turned over with a familiar, reliable rumble. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. He saw Blake, a silhouette in his office, a man whose life had just been dismantled. John felt no joy, no sense of victory. Only a quiet, profound sadness that a man could get so lost in the symbols of wealth that he could no longer recognize the real thing. He drove on, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, a silent, majestic testament to the real power that governed his world. The gate was still broken, and the hinges were waiting. The work was never done, and for that he was grateful. The drive out of Garrison was a process of decompression, of shedding the artificial skin of the town and easing back into his own. The adrenaline from the confrontation in the bank ebbed away, leaving a strange hollowness in its place. The clean lines of the town's architecture gave way to the unruly, organic sprawl of the countryside. Fence lines, patched and repaired over generations, traced the contours of the land like ancient scars. The truck's tires hummed on the asphalt, a familiar mantra. John thought of his father, a man of few words and immense presence. He'd be 75 now if he were still alive. He'd taught John everything he knew, not with lectures, but with silence and example. "The land doesn't care about your feelings, son," he'd say after a hailstorm had shredded a promising crop. "It only cares what you do next." What had he done today? He hadn't just withdrawn his employment, he had shattered a man's life. The thought was a burr under his saddle. Was that who he was now? A man who wielded his power like a club. The reflection in the dusty rearview mirror showed a stranger's eyes, harder than he remembered. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress of quiet dignity, and today he had been forced to man the battlements. He turned off the county highway onto the long gravel road that led to his homestead. The dust plumed up behind him, a golden cloud in the late afternoon light. This was his sanctuary. The main house, built by his great-grandfather from timber cleared from the land itself, stood sentinel on a low rise, its white paint peeling in testament to its age and endurance. Barns and outbuildings were clustered around it, their metal roofs the color of rust and sunset. As he crested the final hill, his eyes, trained by decades of observation, automatically scanned his property. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the west pasture. The equipment was lined up neatly by the machine shed. Everything was in its place, except for one thing. A sleek, black sedan was parked half a mile down the road, tucked into a small stand of cottonwood trees where the road curved. It wasn't a local car. It had the aggressive, predatory lines of an expensive city vehicle. John slowed his truck, his instincts tingling. People didn't just stop out here. There was nothing to see but land. He committed the license plate to memory, a habit ingrained from years of dealing with everything from lost tourists to would-be poachers. The car remained still as he passed, a dark, silent predator waiting in the tall grass. The hollowness in his chest was replaced by a cold knot of apprehension. The battle he thought he had won might have just been the opening skirmish of a war he didn't even know he was fighting. In a steel and glass tower 200 miles away, a world of refrigerated air and whispered conversations, Richard Sterling watched the numbers dance across a wall of monitors. Sterling was the CEO of AgriCorp, a multinational conglomerate that viewed farmland not as a legacy, but as an asset class. He was a man who saw the world as a spreadsheet, and he was a master at manipulating the variables. His office was a minimalist shrine to power, overlooking the city from the 60th floor. He hadn't touched soil with his bare hands since he was a child. He didn't need to. He employed armies of analysts and agronomists to do that for him. His phone chimed, a discreet, custom tone. The caller ID was marked private. He swiped to answer. Yes, he did it. He actually did it, a voice on the other end said. It was thin, reedy, laced with a desperate, bitter energy. They fired me on the spot, in front of everyone. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, a faint, predatory smile touching his lips. Blake, I trust you secured the information I requested before your dramatic departure. I did, Blake Harrison spat. I have everything. Agri Vest's complete transaction history for the last 10 years, tenant lists, lease agreements. Everything you wanted. Davies is a fool. He left my network access active for a full hour after he fired me. An hour is all I needed. Excellent, Sterling purred. He had cultivated Blake for months, a discontented asset inside the key financial institution of Garrison County. He had sensed the young man's toxic blend of ambition and insecurity, and knew he could be easily manipulated. The public humiliation was an unexpected but useful catalyst. A motivated fool was the most dangerous weapon in the world. Your severance package has been wired to the offshore account as we discussed. You'll find it generous. What are you going to do? Blake asked, a hint of nervous curiosity in his voice. Mr. Miller has made the classic mistake of the old guard, Sterling said, his eyes scanning the data Blake had sent, which was already being algorithmically analyzed on one of his screens. He thinks because he won a battle in his own backyard, he's safe. But the world is not a collection of backyards anymore. It's a single, interconnected battlefield, and he just revealed the location of his castle. Sterling's eyes narrowed as the analysis flagged a name. The Henderson Farm, a multi-generational tenant on Miller's land, over-leveraged, behind on their equipment loans, a weak link in the chain. Thank you for your service, Blake. I suggest you take a long vacation, somewhere with no extradition. He ended the call before Blake could reply, his attention already focused on his next move. He swiveled his chair to face the sprawling city below. He saw a network, a system to be controlled. John Miller saw a farm. That, Sterling thought with a cold certainty, is why the old man was about to lose it all. He pressed a button on his console. Get me the head of acquisitions. We're going to buy a farm. The call came just after dawn the next morning. John was in the machine shed, calibrating a seed drill, his hands coated in a familiar film of grease and dust. The phone buzzed against the metal workbench. It was Tom Henderson, his voice tight with panic. John, I've got a problem, a big one. John wiped his hands on a rag. Easy, Tom, what's going on? AgriCorp, Tom said, the name sounding like a curse. A man from AgriCorp showed up this morning, a lawyer. He said they'd bought my equipment loan from the bank in the city. The whole note said I was in technical default. They're calling it due, all of it. Now, John, I don't have that kind of cash. They're going to take everything. The combines, the tractors, I'll be ruined. The cold knot in John's stomach tightened. AgriCorp. It wasn't a coincidence. They had found the weakest point and were applying pressure with surgical precision. This wasn't a business move, it was an attack. Stay put, Tom. Don't sign anything. Don't even talk to them. I'm on my way. He hung up the phone, the metallic taste of battle in his mouth again. He looked at his greasy hands. His father had taught him that these hands could fix anything that was broken. But this was a different kind of broken. This was a sickness that couldn't be fixed with a wrench and a length of wire. He walked out of the shed into the crisp morning air. The sun was just clearing the horizon, casting long shadows across his land. His land asterisk. The words had a new weight now. They weren't just a statement of ownership. They were a declaration of war. He climbed into the old Ford, the reliable rumble of the engine a small comfort. The black sedan was gone. The enemy was no longer watching from a distance. They were inside his gates. He found Tom Henderson standing in his own farmyard, looking like a man who'd just been told his house was on fire. A crisp suit, the lawyer from AgriCorp, was leaning against a pristine rental car, a sheaf of papers in his hand, a smug look on his face. He was a field soldier in Sterling's army. "Mr. Miller," the lawyer said, his voice slick. "I was just explaining the realities of contract law to Mr. Henderson." "I know the reality of contracts," John said, his voice level as he got out of his truck. "I also know the reality of predatory lending. You bought that note for pennies on the dollar yesterday, and you know it." The lawyer shrugged. "Good business is good business. The debt is valid. Payment is due." John walked over to Tom, putting a steadying hand on the younger man's shoulder. "How much?" he asked quietly. Tom swallowed hard. $280,000. A lifetime of debt, accrued one piece of machinery at a time. John nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the lawyer's. He had the money. He could write a check and end this right now. But he knew it wouldn't end. This was just the first probe. Paying it off would show Sterling that he was willing to bleed. It would only invite a deeper cut next time. He had to change the rules of the fight. He turned his attention back to the lawyer. "You're on private property, and you're harassing my tenant. I want you to leave." The lawyer smirked. "I have a legal right to be here, to discuss the recovery of our assets. The Hendersons have been working this piece of land for 4 generations. John said, his voice dropping, taking on that granite quality again. "They were here long before your company existed, and they'll be here long after it's a footnote in a textbook. You talk about assets. I'm looking at a family. You see a number on a page. I see a legacy. Now I'm going to tell you one last time, get off my land." He took a step forward. He wasn't a large man, but he carried the quiet authority of the earth itself. The lawyer's smirk faltered. He looked from John's hardened face to Tom Henderson's desperate one. He saw an equation that wasn't in his legal playbook. He had been sent to squeeze a farmer, not confront a king. He made a business decision. "This isn't over," he said, retreating to his car. "Our offer to buy Mr. Henderson out of his lease stands. It's a generous one." He got in, the car crunching on the gravel as it sped away. Tom looked at John, his face a mask of relief and terror. "What do we do now? They'll be back." "Let them come," John said, his mind already working, sifting through possibilities. "They want a fight, we'll give them one. But we're not going to fight them in a courtroom or on a balance sheet. We're going to fight them here, in the dirt." He needed a weapon, but not one of finance. He needed one of history. He thought of his grandfather's office, a room he hadn't entered in years, a dusty time capsule filled with old ledgers, maps, and journals, a place where the secrets of the land were written in ink and paper. The handshake deal, the 90-year-old lease, the foundation of everything. He had a sudden, chilling thought. What if the foundation wasn't as solid as he believed? What if, in all those years, his family had overlooked a crack, a vulnerability that a man like Sterling could exploit to bring the whole castle down? The hook was set. Now he had to find out just how deep it went. That evening, the air grew thick with the promise of a storm that wouldn't come. The sky was a bruised purple, but the clouds held their reign. John stood before the door to his grandfather's office. It was at the back of the house, a room his father had kept locked after the old man died, more out of reverence than any real need for security. John slid the old iron key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant, grinding sound, like a bone setting. The air that met him was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco, a ghost of the man who had laid the foundations of the Miller Empire. The room was just as he remembered it from childhood, a massive oak desk, walls lined with books on agriculture and engineering, and roll after roll of hand-drawn survey maps. It was the nerve center of a bygone era. For the next several hours, by the light of a single desk lamp, he delved into the past. He unrolled maps yellowed with age, their lines tracing the acquisition of the land parcel by parcel, a slow, patient conquest over decades. He opened ledgers, the columns of figures written in his grandfather's elegant, confident script. It was all there. The cost of seed, the price of cattle, the wages paid to farmhands. A life's work documented in meticulous detail. Then he found it. Tucked inside a thick ledger from 1934, the year the bank branch was built, was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a formal contract. It was a letter, written on First National Bank letterhead, from Franklin Davy's grandfather to John's. It outlined the terms of the 99-year lease for the bank property. The rent was absurdly low, a symbolic gesture, but it was the final paragraph that made the blood drain from John's face. In consideration of this favorable lease, asterisk it read, the bank agrees to extend a permanent, revolving line of credit to the Miller family and their designated tenants at a fixed prime rate to ensure the continued prosperity of the Garrison agricultural community which we both serve. It was a gentleman's agreement, a relic of a time when a man's word and a handshake were worth more than a team of lawyers. But it was in writing, a permanent line of credit. It was the weapon he needed. AgriCorp was using debt to attack his tenants. But this letter, this ghost from the past, gave John the power to arm them, to make them untouchable. It was more than a line of credit. It was a shield. But as he read it again, a cold dread crept in. The agreement was with the Asterisk Bank, the same bank now run by men like Blake Harrison, a bank that had become a subsidiary of a larger, faceless national corporation headquartered in Chicago. Would they even honor an 80-year-old piece of paper? Or would they see it as a liability, a loophole to be closed at any cost? He had found the sword in the stone. Now he had to find out if he was still worthy to wield it. John called Franklin Davies the next morning. He didn't go through the switchboard. He used the private cell number Davies had insisted he take. "Franklin, it's John Miller. I need to see you. It's about the original lease agreement." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Davies' voice a little strained. "John, good to hear from you, of course. But could it wait a day or two? We're in the middle of a corporate audit. Head office is breathing down our necks." John's instincts flared. An audit, now. It was too much of a coincidence. The auditors, are they from AgriCorp's parent company by any chance? The silence on the line was his answer. Sterling wasn't just attacking his tenants. He was launching a pincer movement, using his corporate influence to put pressure on the bank itself. They were looking for the same thing he was, the cracks in the foundation. "I'm on my way, Franklin. Don't sign anything until I get there." The atmosphere in the Garrison branch was even colder than before. The friendly face of Sarah, the new interim manager, was strained. Two men in severe, dark suits stood with Franklin Davies in his office. They had the humorless, predatory look of corporate auditors. They were Sterling's true soldiers, armed not with guns but with calculators and bylaws. John walked straight into the office, the old letter in his hand. "Franklin," he said, his voice calm, "these gentlemen, I assume, are here to discuss the bank's legacy agreements." Davies looked relieved and terrified at the same time. One of the auditors, a man with a face like a clenched fist, stepped forward. "Mr. Miller, I'm David Chen from the parent corporation's Risk Management Division. We're reviewing all outstanding liabilities. Your family's lease and the associated credit agreement represent a significant and, frankly, unacceptable exposure for this institution." "An exposure," John said, his voice quiet. "My family's loyalty, the very land your bank is built on. You call that an exposure?" "It's an anachronism," Chen said, his voice devoid of emotion. "A relic of a business model that no longer exists. We are prepared to offer you a substantial buyout of the lease and terminate the credit agreement. A one-time payment, very generous." "My land isn't for sale," John said, "and that credit agreement is the lifeblood for half the farmers in this county. It's the reason this bank has any customers left at all." "The agreement is non-binding," Chen countered. "A letter of intent. In a modern legal context, it's unenforceable." This was the moment of truth. John laid the old letter on Davies' desk. "It was a promise between your grandfather and mine, Franklin. This bank was built on that promise." He looked from Davies' conflicted face to Chen's implacable one. He knew he couldn't win a legal fight against a corporate behemoth. He had to change the battlefield. "You call this letter a liability," John said to Chen, "but you've forgotten what a real liability looks like." He pulled out his old checkbook. The auditors exchanged a look of smug amusement. Davies, however, looked like he was about to be sick. John began to write, not one check but dozens. He had the account numbers of every one of his tenants. He started transferring his own funds, massive amounts, into their operating accounts. He was shoring up their defenses, making them immune to AgriCorp's debt attacks. The numbers grew, climbing into the tens of millions. The auditors watched, their amusement turning to confusion, then to alarm. "What are you doing?" Chen demanded. "You're worried about the liability of a small, fixed-rate credit line," John said, not looking up from his writing. "I'm about to create a much bigger one. I am personally capitalizing every independent farmer in this valley. I'm turning Agri-Vest into its own agricultural bank, with your institution as my processor. Your risk exposure isn't going away. It's about to get 100 times bigger. Every one of these farmers is now a Protocol Omega client by proxy. My proxy." He looked up, his eyes locking with Chen's. "Unless you honor the original agreement, the simple, elegant promise between gentlemen. You provide the fixed-rate credit, I provide the capital guarantee. We cut AgriCorp and their predatory loans out of this valley for good." He had laid a trap. Chen could refuse, and John would simply move his entire financial operation, tens of millions in assets and the business of the entire agricultural community, to a rival bank. Or he could agree, honoring the old way, and in doing so, insulate Garrison County from Sterling's attack. It was a brilliant, audacious move. He was using their own rules of risk and capital against them. Franklin Davies looked at the checks, at the letter, at his auditor's stunned face. For the first time in a long time, He looked like the grandson of the man who had made a promise on a handshake. He smiled. "Mr. Chen," Davy said, his voice firm, "I think we have an agreement to honor." A long, dry summer settled over Garrison County. The fields grew thirsty, the earth cracking like old leather. The initial victory at the bank had created a firewall, protecting the local farmers from Agri-Corp's financial assaults. But Richard Sterling was not a man who accepted defeat. If he couldn't win with money, he would win with nature itself. Or rather, by strangling it. Upstream, along the Garrison River that fed the entire valley, parcels of land that had been fallow for decades were suddenly bought up by anonymous shell corporations. Within weeks, new pumping stations and irrigation canals began to appear, diverting a massive portion of the river's flow before it ever reached the valley. It was a legal, sophisticated, and utterly ruthless maneuver. Sterling was buying the water out from under them. The flow of the Garrison River slowed to a trickle. The corn in the fields began to wilt, the leaves curling in on themselves in a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. A low-grade panic began to simmer in the community. John's financial shield was useless against a drought. Some farmers, their life's work turning brown under the relentless sun, began to whisper. They said John had started a war with a giant and had made them all targets. His status as a protector began to erode, replaced by the suspicion that he was the cause of their suffering. The pressure was immense. John spent his days driving the county, meeting with farmers trying to keep their spirits up, but his words felt hollow as the dust settled on his dashboard. At night, he would walk his own fields, the dry stalks crunching under his boots like bones. The land was in pain, and he could feel it in his own gut. He had to do something, but he was fighting an enemy he couldn't see, an enemy who wielded water rights like a weapon of mass destruction. He returned once more to his grandfather's office, to the maps and the journals, searching not for a legal loophole but for a memory, a story, a whisper of old knowledge. He spent days poring over his grandfather's journals, detailed accounts of the Dust Bowl years, of the desperate fight for survival. And then he found it. A series of entries from 1936 describing a wildcat drilling project. His grandfather, convinced there was a deep aquifer beneath their land, had spent a fortune, money he didn't have, drilling a test well. The project had failed. They had hit granite and the drill bit had broken. The family was nearly bankrupted. It was a story of failure, a cautionary tale his father had never spoken of. But as John read closer, he saw his grandfather's meticulous geological notes, his belief that they had simply stopped drilling 100 feet too soon. "The water is there," the final entry read. "I can feel it, it sleeps, but it is there." It was a madman's prophecy, a forgotten dream, and it was the only hope he had left. The decision was a monumental gamble. To drill that deep, to bring in the specialized equipment needed to punch through granite, would cost millions. It would mean liquidating stocks, leveraging a portion of his own land, risking the very legacy he was trying to protect. Franklin Davies, when John came to him to secure the financing, thought he had lost his mind. "John, this is reckless. You're betting the farm on a dead man's hunch from 80 years ago." "My grandfather wasn't a reckless man," John replied. "He was just ahead of his time. The technology didn't exist then. It does now." The bank, bound by their renewed agreement and John's immense capital, had no choice but to back his play. The giant drilling rig that arrived in Garrison County was a spectacle. It looked like a dinosaur, an ancient beast come to pierce the heart of the earth. They set it up on the exact spot marked on his grandfather's old map. The drilling began. For days, the only sound was the relentless, grinding roar of the engine and the screech of steel on stone. Sterling heard about the project, of course. He thought it was a pathetic, desperate act, the death throes of an old man clinging to superstition. He increased the water diversion upstream, tightening the noose. The valley was days away from total crop failure. On the 5th day of drilling, the foreman came to John, his face grim. "We're burning through bits, Mr. Miller. This is the hardest rock I've ever seen. Another day of this and we're done. There's nothing here." The hope in the valley had evaporated. The farmers watched the silent, motionless rig from a distance, a monument to a failed gamble. John stood by the rig, the dust caking his face, the weight of 100 families on his shoulders. He looked up at the merciless, brassy sky. "The water is there," his grandfather had written. He walked to the foreman. "Keep drilling," he said. The foreman argued, but something in John's eyes silenced him. The rig roared back to life. Hours passed. The sun began to set, casting the rig in a long, skeletal shadow. And then a change in the sound. The high-pitched scream of the drill lowered to a deep, resonant growl. The ground trembled. A low rumble came from deep within the earth. And then a gusher of muddy water shot out of the borehole, 100 feet into the air. It wasn't a trickle. It was a river born from the heart of the planet. The crew shouted in disbelief. Farmers who had been watching from their trucks got out and stared, their faces filled with awe. John stood still, letting the cool spray wash the dust from his face. It felt like a baptism. His grandfather had been right. The Miller Aquifer was real. The discovery of the aquifer changed everything. It wasn't just a well. It was a vast, sustainable water source that could irrigate the entire valley for a century. The news spread like wildfire. AgriCorp's multi-million-dollar water diversion project was rendered instantly worthless. Richard Sterling's primary weapon had been disarmed. The stock price of AgriCorp, already precarious due to its over-leveraged position, began to plummet as news of their strategic failure in Garrison County hit the financial markets. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. John Miller was no longer a farmer defending his land. He was the king of a new resource, a water baron in a thirsty world. He established a water cooperative for the local farmers, providing them with a secure and affordable water supply, cementing their loyalty for generations. He had not just saved them, he had made them prosperous. The final confrontation took place, fittingly, at the bank. Franklin Davies had called an emergency meeting. A pale, haggard Richard Sterling was there, his tailored suit looking more like a shroud. He was there to beg, to try and negotiate a restructuring of his company's massive debt to the bank, debt incurred by his failed water project. He was halfway through a desperate, jargon-filled plea when John Miller walked in. The room fell silent. Sterling stared at him, his eyes filled with a new kind of emotion, fear. John didn't raise his voice. He walked to the head of the table. "Franklin," he said calmly, "I'd like to make a transaction. Agri-Vest Properties would like to purchase all of AgriCorp's outstanding debt currently held by this bank." Sterling's face went white. Davies looked at John, a slow smile spreading across his face. He understood. It was the ultimate checkmate. "The debt is distressed," John continued, his eyes locked on Sterling. "I believe the current market value is around 10 cents on the dollar. I'll offer 15. It was a pittance and it was an insult. But the bank, eager to get the toxic asset off its books, instantly agreed. The deal was done in minutes. John turned to Sterling. The arrogance and power were gone, replaced by the hollowed-out look of a defeated man. "You wanted to own a piece of this valley, Mr. Sterling," John said, his voice flat. "Well, now you work for me. As my debtor, you will find I have very high standards." The symmetrical catharsis was complete. The man of finance had been destroyed by finance, wielded by a man of the soil. A week later, the autumn air had a crisp edge to it. John stood on a rise overlooking his land. The fields, irrigated by the new aquifer, were a vibrant green, impossibly lush for the late season. He saw a cloud of dust on the distant county road. A bus pulled to a stop. A single figure got off. Even from a distance, John recognized the slump of the shoulders. It was Blake Harrison. He was no longer wearing a suit, just jeans and a cheap windbreaker. He looked smaller, stripped of the armor of his ambition. He just stood there, staring out at the endless fields. The bus pulled away, leaving him alone in the immense quiet. John considered leaving the young man to his solitude, but that wasn't his way. He began the long walk across the field. Blake saw him coming and flinched. His face was pale and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Harrison," John replied, his tone neutral. "Long way from the city." Blake gave a short, bitter laugh. "There's not much for me in the city anymore. Word travels fast." He shoved his hands in his pockets. I don't know why I came out here. I guess I had to see it, what it was all about." He gestured vaguely at the horizon. "All this." John followed his gaze. "It's just land," he said. "No, it's not," Blake said, shaking his head. "I see that now. I spent my whole life looking at spreadsheets. I thought that was real, wealth, numbers on a screen." He looked down at his own soft, unmarked hands. "You know what the hardest part was? It wasn't getting fired. It was the dollar. You handing me that dollar for the bus." He looked up, and for the first time, John saw not arrogance or fear, but a flicker of genuine, painful understanding. "You weren't mocking me. You were showing me what I had become, someone with nothing. Nothing real." They stood in silence for a few minutes, the wind whispering through the corn. John thought about his own father, who had taught him that the only real wealth was the dirt under your fingernails and the integrity of your word. "My father had a saying," John said softly. "Don't ever trust a man who's afraid to get his hands dirty. He's either hiding something or he's forgotten where things come from." He looked at Blake. "You just forgot where things come from." Blake nodded, a profound sadness in his expression. "They don't teach you that at Stanford." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. The same one. He held it out. "I think this belongs to you." John looked at the dollar, then back at Blake. He shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "Consider it an investment. First lessons free." With that, he turned and began walking back toward his tractor, leaving the former bank manager standing alone on the edge of an empire he had mistaken for a wasteland. The sun was climbing higher. There was still a lot of work to be done. And so, their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. The greatest lesson is that true worth is not what you show the world, but the foundation you build when no one is watching. But as one man breaks the system, another is trapped by it. What happens when the debt isn't just financial, but a blood oath owed to a man who controls the water in a time of drought? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.